Willie Pietersen, welcome to the Elegant Warrior podcast.
Thank you so much, Heather. Great to
I,
be with you.
we chatted just a little bit before we got started,
Yes.
and we were talking about your book, Leadership, the Inside Story, Time-Tested Prescriptions for Those Who Seek to Lead. I loved this book, and I know you've written other books. So what was the impetus behind wanting to take the time and the effort that it takes to write this book?
It kind of wrote itself in a way. I wrote a lot of blogs in my role as a business professor at Columbia. And I guess there were about 21 of them eventually. They went onto the Columbia platform. My wife, who's a writer in her own right, said to me eventually, she said, I've looked at all these blogs. You've got a book there. And I said, well, I don't really. A lot of them are on separate topics. And she said, no, there's a connecting thread that I see running through those blogs. Why don't you start writing a book on them? That's how it all began. And the blogs reflected a kind of lifelong learning laboratory in a way. I was born and raised in South Africa. During the apartheid era, I lived there. I saw all its manifestations. I learned from it. I practiced law like you did. And then I went into a corporate career, was a CEO for 20 years, and now at Columbia for 26 years as a professor of the practice of management. What that gave me was a kaleidoscope of learning, of observing other leaders, of experiencing the impact of leaders like Nelson Mandela and people like that. And that kind of learning laboratory, if you like, gave birth to these ideas that I've expressed in my book.
So good. I think you'll appreciate this, Willie. My dog wants to get in my lap. And since you have the Maisie chapter, I think it's okay
Oh,
to let him up on my lap. Normally, I might try to make him stay quiet, but I think he'll be more quiet here.
I think he's better on the podcast than anywhere else.
Oh my goodness,
He humanizes us, right?
that's without a doubt. Because this morning when I was trying to get him to do what I wanted him to do, there's just no having it. Your experience, I mean, you make the point that you have had so many different experiences, and so much of that goes into the book. In the book, you talk about, and I loved this, you talked about evolution, philosophy, and astrophysics
Yes.
as contributing to your ideas around leadership. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing, actually. I'm a business professor. I was a business guy, and I read very few business books, to be honest. I do read some. I try and filter and find the gems, and I read them thoroughly. I glance through a lot of them, but I don't digest a lot of them. I find that I get most of my nourishment in terms of ideas from areas outside of business. So these are my reading hobbies: philosophy, evolutionary science, and astrophysics. Now, here, just a brief word. And philosophy is a very interesting subject because it gives us answers to three things: what's true, what's important, and what's right. And I think that's what philosophy gives us answers to all the time. For example, I teach a short course on ethics from time to time. Now, Plato gave us a definition of ethics more than 2,000 years ago, and nobody has ever improved on it. Here it is. He said, ethical behavior is behaving in the public interest, regardless of who is watching, without the expectation of a reward and without the fear of punishment. Now, after 2,500 years, has anybody improved on that idea?
No.
So when I start a class on ethics, I put that definition up on a screen and say, let's talk. Let's talk about the dilemmas that we confront and how we can solve those dilemmas with reference to that.
Yep.
Then the other thing about philosophy is, as we think about it, what's true, what's important, and what's right. Sometimes the biggest, most agonizing choices are between right and right. Right and wrong, that's simple. And when we grapple with that, we go back and say, well, then what's important? And that brings us back to philosophy, right? So that's the philosophical angle, I think, that enriches our lives. Evolutionary science tells us that we have to learn and grow as organizations or as human beings.
Yep.
Otherwise, we can't expect to survive or thrive.
Right.
So, there are laws and there are choices. Gravity is a law. You can't throw a ball in the air and say, I choose for it to stay up there. It'll fall down. That's a law.
Yep.
Evolutionary science is the same. We either obey that law or we subject to its consequences. And astrophysics, for me, is the biggest subject in the world. There's a quote at the end of my book from Ray Bradbury that sums up the interest in astrophysics, is that we are born to understand and gaze at the wonders of the universe and understand who we are, where we fit in, and what's important. It's humbling. And it's a really important thing. As humans, we think we're so important. We're small players in a big universe. But in our short lives, we have just enough time to make a difference.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I take out of astrophysics.
Oh my gosh. I mean, mic drop there, Mr. Pietersen. That is really unbelievable. I'm so tempted to go down a rabbit hole about something I read today about Elon Musk's satellites messing with astronomy, but I will not because it will take us away from the topic. But I have not been invested in astrophysics, though I am a lot like you and I like to read outside of the business book genre. I read a lot of fiction, I read
Yes.
other things.
Mhm.
But I think that those three, evolution, philosophy, and astrophysics, they really do encompass so many parts of leadership. And you know that you've studied a philosophy because you sort of start the book, by sort of start, you really do start the book with a Marcus Aurelius quote, reference about our command center. And
Yeah.
in my work, I do work with coaching and memberships and groups and so forth. I talk a lot about being your own authority, which is a very similar
Same
idea.
idea.
A very similar idea. And I loved you had within 2 pages of that, you had two quotes. One is a Finnish quote about a blacksmith, and
Yes.
the other is a Voltaire quote about a garden. Would you
Yeah.
share those two quotes and why you led the book with that premise?
Ah, yes. Well, to begin with, let's talk about leadership for a minute. It's a big subject. People sometimes think it's about exercising power, or it's about making bold decisions. Well, no, it's not about power, it's about service to begin with. Secondly, to really understand leadership and help us grow and flourish as leaders, we need to understand its basics, its fundamentals. I believe it has three domains. Domain number one is personal leadership. It's deep self-knowledge. It's the development of a sound set of principles that guide our actions and inspire others. That's where it all begins. That's what forms our character and defines who we are. Makes us authentic, credible, and sincere. Second domain of leadership is strategic leadership, the ability to set a clear direction for your organization and a winning way. And the third domain of leadership is interpersonal leadership. That's bringing out the best in others. But these three domains need to work together synergistically so that we become integrated leaders, combining all of them together so they work together in that kind of mutual interdependence fashion. Now, what this does for us is it helps us to think purposefully about how we lead by thinking about these three domains. It helps us understand diagnostically how we're doing when we reflect and meet new challenges. Where do I need to put more emphasis? Is it on my personal, interpersonal? Is it on the strategic front? When you seek feedback, rather than saying, how am I doing, which is a paralyzing general question, say, look, I've got these three domains. Tell me how I'm doing in this one, and that one, the three, and you get much more useful feedback. This helps us grow and develop. So back now to the quotes. It starts with personal leadership, right? That's permission to lead.
Yeah.
And as we develop those principles, this is what captured my attention in philosophy from Marcus Aurelius, who called this our command center. And I love that idea. It's not just a loose set of ideas, it's a command center. It's a firm set of principles. I think you use often in your podcasts the importance of beliefs, not just ideas.
Yeah.
Because beliefs galvanize action And beliefs are things that really ground you in what's important. So that's the first one. That's the Marcus Aurelius. It's your command center. Now, as we grow and develop, we come to this Finnish proverb. Everybody is a blacksmith of their own happiness.
Yes.
Now, I like that because you don't make me happy. I hope circumstances will make me happy. No, it's how you relate to circumstances that makes you happy. So we're blacksmiths of our own happiness. I believe in the same way that we blacksmiths of our own leadership development. We can't expect others to give it to us as a gift. It's a continuous learning process where we develop and grow as leaders. We are blacksmiths of our own leadership effectiveness. Nobody's going to bequeath it to us as a gift. And the third one relates to that, actually. This is Voltaire saying, you know, we have to cultivate our own garden. Now, it's good to get other people to give you feedback, but feedback is the material that you absorb in order to develop your own competencies, your own way forward. We have to create and develop and nourish our own gardens.
So good. And I love how you put those quotes together in such a well-written way, and you lead with that. And you also lead, you've mentioned the word learn at least a dozen times in the short time that we've been talking. And one of the first chapters is about learning to learn. And on page 43, I was surprised. I did not know about, I'm going to slay his name, Ebbinghaus.
Yes, Hermann Ebbinghaus.
Yes, yes. And he said that in the absence of countermeasures, the average person loses up to 90% of new information after 30 days. That is, I guess it shouldn't be shocking to me, but it's frustrating to me and makes me want to make sure that doesn't happen. And then you talk about the 3 antidotes to that. Can you take the listeners through that?
Yes, by all means. And this again is, you know, the facts don't go away just because we don't look at them.
True.
This is one of these things. I love evidence-based points of view. And this guy was a serious researcher. His interest, Ebbinghaus, was in studying memory, human memory, what makes for good memory. What he discovered was the opposite, that our main capacity is not to remember, it's to forget. Now, that's a fact. We can't make it go away. Question is, what do we do about that? Because as learning organisms, to help us adapt, if we don't absorb and remember the critical things that we learn, it just kind of goes like an express train through our minds. So there are important antidotes that he provides. First antidote is crucial. Write down what you have learned in the moment. Write it down. To write is to think. Formulate it clearly. Write it down. Not in scraps of paper that just vanish and you start looking for, where's this little scrap of paper? Keep a learning journal. I've done that since I was 16 years old. I've kept a learning journal. I've got a pile of them now. So that's antidote number 1, write it down. Secondly, regularly retrieve what you've written.
Yeah.
Go back to it. I love Saturday mornings. I read, you know, newspapers, opinion columns, and then I glance before running a 3 or 4 day program at Columbia. I kind of page through my learning journal. And I always find a little gem in there that relates to what I'm going to be teaching. Mm. And it's a reminder to me.
Yep.
When I started writing this book that you so kindly mentioning, the first thing I did is go through all my learning journals. That's the very first thing I did. Yeah. And it's now got these tabs that it didn't have before: philosophy, astroscience, right, and evolutionary science. Yeah. So, you know, so I've kept it, I've tried to organize it that way. And the third one is practice what you've learned and practice it regularly. Yeah. So, you know, we in many ways, we behave our way into a new way of thinking. So this is kind of one of those kind of ideas. You know, you can think your way into a new way of behaving, but unless you start behaving those thoughts, they don't take hold. And then you begin to think your way into your way into a new way of behaving.
Yeah. Tell me this, when you talk about writing it down, this is something that I go back and forth on. I have notoriously been a handwriting person, and then
Yes.
it does seem that it's a lot easier to keep notes on the phone or on the computer, but
Oh,
I have a bias towards writing. Do you have that same bias?
I think it's essential.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's essential. A Word document seems to me in some way to be a sterile way
Yeah. I
of doing
agree.
it. When you write it down, you're thinking about what you're writing. Now, let me tell you an inspiring example for me. I got to know a surgeon, pioneering surgeon. He's one of the pioneers of robotic surgery, a guy called Dr. Ash Tawari.
Oh, yeah.
And I used to take groups of executives to go and speak to him and his staff about how he ran his pioneering practice of surgery and taught others, etc. And he was a combination scientist, teacher, etc. He's an Indian guy, so very kind of Zen-like in his approach. And it emerged that he keeps a learning journal. And one of the things he does, he's got hundreds of applicants who want to join his team as surgeons, as researchers, and as assistants, etc. He's got one knockout factor. You must keep a learning journal if you work for me. Now, you're free not to keep a learning journal. That's your choice. But then you don't work here.
Right.
And he lost a lot of really good people who said, well, I don't do that as a habit. So he keeps learning journal. And then every week, the first surgery takes place at about 7:30 in the morning.
Right.
The surgery is the scarce resource in a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Beds are as well, of course, but so you have to start as early as possible. He will
Yeah.
meet very early once a week for a learning session. And he would go around the room and call on people. What did you learn this week? Quote from your learning journal.
So good.
So to the others, did you learn something new? If you did, write it in your journal. And then he'd call on himself. This is what I've learned. This is the humility he showed as a learner. And he would quote from it. He asked me to dinner and he said, well, you bring the latest learning journal and I'll bring mine.
I
Okay.
love it.
We hardly ate dinner. I mean, we sat there. I was completely embarrassed because mine has got a hardcover, but it's kind of a moleskin thing.
Yeah.
And I showed him my notes in pencil. He opened his, it had a leather cover. It's written in ink. It's got beautiful diagrams. He draws beautifully.
Oh,
So
yes.
it was a metaphor. He doesn't just write words. He draws a tree or he draws something that kind of captures an idea or a balloon or something like that. Above every insight that he writes down, he writes a question above it. He said, every insight is an answer to a question. You must understand the question first. And I thought, well, now I'm humbled. Now I'm
I'm,
a well
I'm
learner.
way humbled. I'm way
Yeah,
humbled. That's
completely. I said, well, let's hide these things and have dinner.
let's eat.
So, what a wonderful example of being a lifelong learner and serving as a role model to others.
Well, and I don't know if you know this, but my background is I defended doctors in medical malpractice cases for 20
Ah,
years. And one of
yeah.
the things that I think that's so good about that is he's teaching those young doctors how to be leaders and how to
Yes,
learn and how to
yes,
be okay with learning. Because one of the things that I did see in that role was what they call white coat syndrome, the unwillingness or aversion to admitting mistakes and talking about problems and
exactly.
not knowing something. And so what a
Exactly.
beautiful way for him to teach those residents, those fellows, those young doctors so many things with that simple learning journal. And now you've motivated me to, because right now I have the equivalent of scraps of paper. There's notes in my phone. I do have a journal, but I don't bring it with me everywhere I go. And so I want to be more deliberate about how I use that. Thanks to you. I Another thing that I really wanted to make sure I asked you about is you have a chapter on asking the right questions. And my job as a trial attorney, all I did was ask questions all day long. And so I'm very aware of the power of questions. I did not know the history of the Revolutionary War and the question that was asked. The American Rebel Army was close to defeat And if you could tell that story, because then, Willie, I have a question for you about it that's been nagging at me since I read this.
Certainly will. May I just go back one step and just
Yes,
talk about doctors and mistakes
of course, of course.
quickly, just and then I'll come back to the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
My father died at the age of 61 from an aortic aneurysm that was not detected and diagnosed, and it was a medical mistake. So he died suddenly from this aneurysm. He'd been complaining about discomfort and pain, and they kept misdiagnosing it. We had a wonderful family doctor. This is way back in South Africa. I was 23, 24 years old.
Yeah.
And the doctor came to see us the next morning. And my sister and I were there, and my father had remarried, and so my stepmother was there. And he sat and he said, "I'm so sorry about this, and I must tell you that your father should not have died. He died through a mistake, and the mistake was mine. I'm here to apologize." The first thing that happened is my sister got up and hugged him. Now, that's the difference between hiding a mistake
Yeah.
and trying to evade responsibility
Yeah.
and owning up to it with moral courage and then having this kind of response.
Yep.
He became a very dear friend in the years subsequently. Every time I visited South Africa, I took Dr. Goldswain to lunch. I loved this man
Yeah.
for his integrity. I just wanted to tell you that
No,
story.
it's such an important story. I actually worked on the legislation in Pennsylvania around the apology rule, which it's a rabbit hole we don't have to go down.
Yeah.
But there's such a fear of litigation that sometimes doctors who want to do what you just described are afraid to do it. And I've always been such a proponent of it for a million reasons.
Yes.
Not the least of which it might avoid lawsuits, but also it just answers questions and it builds connection and it allows people to have closure and so many things. And I'm so sorry that your father went too soon, but I'm so glad you had that relationship and that ability to understand and forgive, which is not everyone has that gift. So it's a reflection on you and your sister as well.
Well, it's kind of you to say that, but I appreciated his humanity and his humility,
Without
and
a
I think
doubt.
that is a very humanizing thing.
Without a doubt.
I just wanted to relate that story, building on what we talked about
Yeah.
before. Now back to the American
Yes,
Revolution.
yes.
Now, a number of your viewers and listeners might not be born in America, but just briefly, America fought a war of independence against the British in the 18th century. At that time, there were 13 separate colonies here. Now we have 50 states in a republic. But each of them had a militia, and it was decided to fight this Revolutionary War after the Declaration of Independence, right? It was a defiant act of rebellion. George Washington was asked to lead these disparate forces who didn't even have the same uniforms, had never trained together before, to lead them in this effort to create freedom and, if you like, kick the British out of North America. Well, they were completely outmatched. And not surprisingly, in the early stages of the war, they were in a very kind of defensive situation, I believe, in the northern parts of Manhattan. The story goes, and it's captured in diaries that we kept at the time, that he sat around the campfire speaking to his senior officers and said, "We're in a dire situation and on the point of losing this war. So we must find a way through." And he sat with them and said, "Now, let's answer this question. We have to answer this question. How can we defeat the British?" And ideas came and were, people battled with the ideas to and fro in an intense discussion. The stakes were everything here.
Yeah.
And none of the ideas were practical. They addressed reality, said that can't work because of this or because of that. The British were the most formidable fighting force in the world at the time. They had a giant empire, the greatest navy in the world, the most formidable military. And eventually, after a lot of intense toing and froing, one of the officers said, "I think we're asking the wrong question. There's no good answer to how can we defeat the British. The real question, the right question is, how can we avoid losing?"
Yeah.
And that gave way to a whole new strategy.
Yeah.
That question won the war. How can we avoid losing?
Yep.
It gave rise to the whole initiative of commando raids. You know, war at that stage of in history was a war of confrontation between forces that had these battles and withdraw and leave a lot of dead on the battlefield. So a commando raids was something new. Rapid surprise raids on the British, on their columns, and then quick withdrawals before taking losses. And the underlying idea was if they did this for long enough, they would exhaust the British, who would then go home. And it worked with the help of the French in the final push. That single breakthrough question, it didn't just drop out of the sky. It came out of an intense discussion and exploration and exchange of ideas, clashing ideas. And a lot of that kind of intellectual effort went into it, but the right question came and won the war. We all need to know what the right questions are when we explore. Everything we know in the world, in science and in general knowledge, came from a question somebody asked.
Yes.
Einstein asked this question that gave rise to E equals mc squared.
Yes.
He didn't just sit there playing his violin and say, oh, E equals mc squared.
Yeah.
He thought about this thing. And for the first time in history of science, connected energy, mass, and speed in one equation. A gigantic breakthrough because of the question that he posed. And so it goes on. Science learns this way, by the way, also starts with an hypothesis. I wonder whether this is true, does experiments, sees if it's true, if it's not, keeps experimenting. So, you know, importance of questions.
Well, and it's fascinating. The surgeon, I'm already forgetting his name, but that you were just referencing in his learning journal, he after he has an insight, he writes what the question was, which feeds in so beautifully to this book and all of the things that you share. It's a new way of looking. That question, how do we avoid losing? I think I spent as a defense attorney, I spent 25 years being defensive. And so really thinking that question a lot. And it's really important to have a balance between that question and how do we win? Because I think that a lot of times, especially for entrepreneurs, it's like, I don't want to think of the negative. I might manifest it. That's a big thing in the world right now. It's what you think about, you become. And I do believe that. And I also think, to your point, it is practical to look at how can I avoid this launch being a total flop? How can I avoid hiring the wrong person? And so to be willing to look at all of the questions, not just the ones that feel good, I think is really important. And that story that I did not know is one that will stick with me, which I think takes me to something I didn't even mean to talk about, but I think it's storytelling. You talk about storytelling in the book too, as a leadership skill. Talk a little bit about that.
Certainly. Back to questions for a minute.
Yeah. Of course.
I think what you're saying, and I'm really taking this on board because I like what you've just said, is to turn that negative response into a negative answer into a positive response. So when you say, how can we avoid losing, it translated into a positive set of actions.
Yeah.
In the same way, you know, when I was younger and in investing, I was saying, well, how can I win? How can I gain a lot? Now that I'm older, I can't afford to recover from a loss. I can avoid losing, but it leads to a positive action of an investment strategy and asset allocation. So I like the way you translated that. Thank you.
It's something I'll remember.
Yes.
And in large part because it's attached to a story.
Yes, exactly. Now, storytelling. You know, we've now become captive to PowerPoint presentations. And if you go to a town hall meeting, first thing that happens is they say, where's my clicker? You know, let's get this thing. Can you see this? Can you hear me? And then we get a picture show. That is not leadership. You know, we think about the final delivery of a strategy, final deliverable of a strategy as being a document. Now, a document is important. You need to have a reference point, and it's back to writing things down for clarity. Never longer than 10 pages. If it's longer than 10 pages, I call that a general anesthetic, back to the medical field.
Yeah.
It needs to be a big document. As Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, here we go again, French philosopher said when he wrote to a friend, I'm terribly sorry to write you this long letter, but I didn't have time to write you a short one.
Yes.
It's hard work.
Yeah.
Now, here, I mean, I do a lot of work on strategy and leadership as well, a lot of consulting work and all the rest of that. And the question becomes, when you've captured your strategy, how do you galvanize people's motivations, inspiration, their enthusiasm, and their determination to act? Because you want unity of action. How do you motivate that? You can't ask for it. If you could just ask for it, well, then stay at home and write an email and just say, please, I want you to be inspired. Now, people are not inspired or motivated by documents. They're motivated by ideas and by leaders who demonstrate and embody those ideas and believe them, and belief is infectious.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to recapture the ancient tradition of storytelling as leaders. That's what we need to do. Telling the story of a strategy. Why do we need to change? What is the factors in the external environment that govern the actions that we need to take internally? That's the kind of Darwinian imperative of being able to adjust to the external environment. How will we win in this new environment, creating greater value for our customers than the alternatives? How are we going to implement that strategy together? What does it take? Now, there's the logic, and then there's the magic. The magic lies in providing a metaphor, an example, a picture. In a very large company once, I was working with them on their strategy, and we invited the CEO. This was a huge global company. Invited the CEO to come along and listen to the strategy and give us his response. And during the Q&A, one of the participants, and they were all senior leaders, said, tell me, and I won't mention his name for confidentiality, tell me, what does it feel like to be the head of a big global company like this? We've talked about our strategy. We talked about how we create unity of action. What does it feel like to be the head of a giant organization that has to pull all of this together and energize the entire system? What keeps you awake? And he didn't say a word at that time. He went to a flip chart and he drew a gearbox. And he said, I feel as if I'm in charge of a giant gearbox. Most of the people in the room were engineers, by the way, so they could relate to the gearbox idea. I was sitting at the back of the room thinking to myself, where's this going? I don't know where this is. And he said, I have my hand on that large wheel in the gearbox. And every time I turn it just one notch, all the smaller wheels are spinning faster and faster. And those smaller wheels are you. And my job is to make sure I turn that big wheel on just the right issues. Now, each of you also has your hand on a big wheel on the gearbox that meshes with mine. And you have to turn yours on just the right issues. And that's what we're talking about here on the strategy. That's what I think about. That's where unity of action comes from. Then came a real piece of magic. He said, and what is the role of a gearbox? And there was a discussion. Somebody said, it's to transfer power. And he said, exactly. Now, that was his answer. What does it feel like to be the head of a giant? He drew a gearbox and he told a story. Do you know, this was more than 10 years ago. This story still resonates in this company, and it's called The Parable of the Gearbox. And they remind themselves constantly about how you turn that wheel on the right issue, get all the wheels turning together to transfer power. That's a truly, truly motivating and empowering and vivid story.
It's amazing. And it really illustrates something that we talk about here and in my membership a lot, which he also knew his jury, Willie. He knew
Yes,
that the people in front of him were engineers, so they would
correct.
resonate with the gearbox. And he knew
Yes,
that some of those people were more visual than audio. And so he drew the
absolutely right.
picture. It's a
Absolutely right.
beautiful explanation of not only storytelling, but storytelling to the jury that you want
Yes,
to lead.
yes.
And so, oh, I could talk to you all day. Unfortunately, we have got to wrap up. But this book, we're going to put a link to buy it in the show notes. It's Leadership: The Inside Story, Time-Tested Prescriptions for Those Who Seek to Lead. And I have to tell you, I have now ordered your other two books because I enjoyed this so thoroughly. Before I let you go, we have the same three questions that we always end with. And I love you said belief is infectious. We're obsessed with belief here.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what are you working on believing right now? What is a belief that you're trying to build?
Never retire, lead life at a reasonable pace, and keep learning.
Oh, I love it. So good. Now, what book other than your own would you recommend for my listeners?
You know, the loveliest book that I've ever read is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee.
Yes.
It's a morality tale.
Beautiful.
And the moral of the story is just as powerful as what Plato defined in defining ethics.
So good.
And I think young people reading To Kill a Mockingbird, it's a book that's very amenable to young people. It's a book that all young people should read as they think about, what do I believe is right in this life and how will I guide myself?
So good. So good. I loved that book. I loved the Broadway show as well. I loved it. Last question is my favorite question. Your answer to this question will be added to our Elegant Warrior Spotify playlist. What is your theme song when you're walking onto the stage of life? What song is playing in the background?
You know, some of them are kind of jaunty, happy songs, etc., but more philosophical songs, and that's kind of me again, is Bridge Over Troubled Water. I think Paul Simon wrote brilliant lyrics. They're poetic. And I listen not just to, you know, the lovely music of it, but I listen keenly to the lyrics. And it's really about bringing out the best in others and lifting them up when they're down. I love
So
that.
good. So good. Willie, thank you so much for coming on, for spending some time with us, and for putting together this beautiful book. I know that it's going to be helpful to the listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I've enjoyed it.